Welcome to another segment of our Acts Bible study. Today we're looking at the second half of Acts chapter 23 and Acts 24, and it's April 10th, 2026. Here's Acts 23, 12 through 24. The next morning, some Jewish leaders formulated a plot and solemnly promised that they wouldn't eat or drink until they had killed Paul. More than 40 people were involved in the conspiracy. They went to the chief priests and elders and said, "We have solemnly promised to eat nothing until we have killed Paul. You and the council must explain to the commander that you need Paul brought down to you. Pretend that you want to examine his case more closely. We're prepared to kill him before he arrives." Paul's sister had a son who heard about the ambush, and he came to the military headquarters and reported it to Paul. Paul called for one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the commander because he has something to report to him." He took him to the commander and said, "The prisoner Paul asked me to bring this young man to you. He has something to tell you." The commander took him by the hand and withdrew to a place where they could speak privately. He asked, "What do you have to report to me?" He replied, "The Jewish leaders have conspired to ask that you bring Paul down to the council tomorrow. They will pretend that they want to investigate his case more closely. Don't fall for it. More than 40 of them are waiting to ambush him. They have solemnly promised not to eat or drink until they have killed him. They are ready now, awaiting your consent." The commander dismissed the young man, ordering him, "Don't tell anyone that you brought this to my attention." The commander called 2 centurions and said, "Prepare 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to leave for Caesarea at 9 o'clock tonight. Have horses ready for Paul to ride, so they may take him safely to Governor Felix." In our last segment, we talked about the first half of Acts 23, where Paul had gotten crosswise of not only the Jewish authorities, but also the crowds, and he was taken into custody because the Roman commander realized, well, Paul told him that he's a Roman citizen, and so he didn't want the Jewish crowd to attack him. And so we ended with verse 11. "The following night, the Lord stood near Paul and said, 'Be encouraged. Just as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so too you must testify in Rome.'" So we know that that's an endpoint somewhere, but in today's reading, as we finish chapter 23 and move into chapter 24, Paul isn't to Rome yet. He still has more local authorities that he has to meet with and convince, that he's, explain why the Jews want to kill him, basically. So we get this murder plot, which is really interesting. I know a lot of people seem to think that the Bible is just boring. There's not a lot that goes on. And in the book of Acts, there are moments where we see the early church, and it's very, rainbows and unicorns sometimes. It's all the believers got along and everything was wonderful. But as we follow this story of Paul, it gets spicy, right? We don't expect there to be a murder plot, but that is part of what Paul went through as he was, trying to be the apostle to the Gentiles and spread the church. And so we see this murder plot, and the Roman governor, or the commander, I guess, writes to the Roman governor and gets Paul to a separate place, to Caesarea, and to be in front of Felix, who's the Roman governor of that area. So chapter 24 is his meeting with Felix. Some of the Jewish leaders come from Jerusalem to accuse him, And he points out that it wasn't even the people, like the Jerusalem leaders, that really started having a problem with him. It's people from way back in Corinth, I think. And so he's, kind of been followed by a certain group of people that were really unhappy with what he was doing. And he points out at his discussion with Felix, perhaps it concerns this one statement that I blurted out when I was with them. I am on trial before you today because of the resurrection of the dead. So Paul is having this conversation with Felix, and he's basically saying, I'm not sure what their charges are. Maybe it's this. But there's definitely, he's like, you got to find the right people who started this whole problem, and they're not all here. But the writer of Acts then points out Felix, who had an accurate understanding of the way, adjourned the meeting. He said, when Lysias, the commander, arrives from Jerusalem, I will decide this case. He arranged for a centurion to guard Paul. He was to give Paul some freedom, and his friends were not to be hindered in their efforts to provide for him. So, as we've had before, it's an interesting portrait of, I think often we are kind of, I don't know if we're led to believe, or we just think that, well, the Romans really didn't understand anything that was going on, and they saw these different religious groups as just sort of a hassle and a problem. But really, the Roman rulers had interacted with Judaism, with the way, as the Christians are called here, and some of them knew more of what was going on than others did. And so this was all part of, the greater culture. Often in the church we talk about, people talk about the church should stay out of politics, but if we're reading the book of Acts and we're seeing what happened to Paul and the other apostles, they were living their lives within the culture that they were in. They weren't completely separate. They weren't out in the desert, like the desert fathers, like staying away from everyone. But Paul was right there in the midst of things, and the political and cultural climate had a bearing on what was happening. So as Christians, we are not necessarily meant to be completely separate. We're not, meant to stay away or out of politics or have no opinion on culture or politics. But we see that, Paul's witness to the faith ran right up against the powers that be of the time. And some of them were more favorable toward Paul and actually wanted to learn more about what he had to say. He kind of freaks out. The leader, Felix comes, the governor Felix comes back and wants to hear more of what Paul has to say, but then he's like, whoa, this is crazy stuff, and then just kind of leaves Paul there under guard for 2 years, it says. And so then he's on his way to Rome. We know he's gonna get there. God has told him that, but he's not there yet. So I just think it's an interesting thing to think about, how as much as in this country we want to separate things out, we tell people who are in like professional sports that they shouldn't comment on politics. We tell the church to stay out of politics. We kind of want to separate things into different boxes and not have any real thinking about how our lives are a whole, and sometimes a mess, but it's all part of who we are. Well, Paul was a Roman citizen. Paul was a follower of the way. Paul was a Jew who had been a Pharisee, and all of those things were always a part of who he was. And so the fact that we live in a certain time, in a certain place, and are citizens of, a certain earthly place, as well as followers of Jesus, is part of who we are. And we can think on that and be complex people who have opinions and who are trying to figure out the best way to live faithfully, because that's what Paul was doing too. trying to figure out the best way to live faithfully. So, if you're confused or you're not sure, you can always look to, well, Paul went through some really crazy stuff. He was sometimes confused. He also made mistakes, but he was trying to live faithfully. And that's what we are called to do as well. All of who we are, not just the part of us that wants to be religious on Sunday mornings or on one part of the week, but all of who we are is called to be faithful. So that's always a challenge for me. That's a challenge for you. And Paul's story gives us some really interesting insight into how we could interact with the world around us in the culture that we find ourselves. So take a look at Acts 23 and 24 and think about how you, as a person, a whole person, interact with the culture around you and live as faithfully as possible where you are, when you are. And we will talk about Paul's moving on toward Rome, but not quite getting there still in Acts 25 next week. Have a great week. Bye!